Maybe Carlos, just let me know when I can start.
Yeah, I've pressed the button, so just wait about 10 more seconds. That's great.
Hopefully not the nuclear button, and we'll still be here for the rest of the webinar. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, and good afternoon, comrades and friends. Good afternoon as it is here in London, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this webinar on the theme of Black Liberation and People's China, Rediscovering a History of Transcontinental Solidarity, which has been jointly organised by Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group. My name is Keith Bennett, and I'm a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and a member of the coordinating committee of the International Manifesto Group. And the subject of this afternoon's webinar is one that has fascinated me for half a century. I'm therefore really delighted that we have been able to assemble today such a distinguished group of committed experts who have kindly agreed to share some of their insights and the results of their research, scholarship, and activism. The theme of this webinar constitutes a fascinating story and a remarkable chapter of revolutionary history. Over succeeding generations, the form may have changed in accordance with the objective situation and the demands and opportunities of the times, but its essential content has remained the same. When I was growing up and developing my interest in China, for me, the country's opening up didn't just mean the visit of President Nixon in February 1972. It also meant the visit by the delegation of the Black Panther Party, led by Huey P. Newton, in September and October 1971. The inspiration for this meeting was the 65th anniversary of the visit by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and his wife Shirley Graham Du Bois to China in February-March 1959, when the great scholar and revolutionary celebrated his 91st birthday, just after their passports had been restored, the Supreme Court having ruled that their denial on political grounds was unconstitutional, and despite the prescription those documents contained on travelling to the People's Republic. During their stay, the Du Bois received just about every honour that the Chinese state could bestow. On March 14 in Wuhan, joined by the revolutionary American writer Anna Louise Strong, who by then was living in China, they were received by Chairman Mao, who hosted a luncheon in their honour. In her transcript of the event, Strong notes that it was the first time for Mao to meet with an American since 1949. But as we noted in the publicity for this meeting, this is a story that neither begins nor ends with the 1963 visit. Dr. Du Bois himself had previously visited Shanghai in the 1930s. The visit by the poet Langston Hughes had inspired him to write the poem Raw China, which forms part of the title of an important book written by Dr. Gai Yunshang, one of our speakers today. From that same period on, Paul Robeson frequently sang the March of the Volunteers in Chinese, the song that was to become and remains the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. Following on from Dr. Du Bois' visit, it's worth noting that although Chairman Mao issued comparatively few public statements on international affairs, he issued two in support of the black struggle in the United States. The first in August 1963, at the height of the civil rights struggle, at the request of Robert F. Williams, the first African-American leader to publicly advocate armed self-defense, and the second in April 1968, following the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in support of the wave of rebellions that swept the USA's urban centers in response. In both these statements, Mao asserted his belief that the evil system of colonialism and imperialism arose and throve with the enslavement of black people and the trade in black people, and it will surely come to its end with the complete emancipation of the black people. Robert F. Williams, his wife Mabel, and their two sons were to make their home in China for several years. In 1996, at his funeral in Monroe, North Carolina, he was buried in his Mao jacket. Malcolm X, his life tragically cut short, was never able to make it to China, but he referred to China again and again in his writings and speeches, and was a staunch supporter of the Chinese Revolution. As a typical example, in November 1964, at a rally in Harlem, he said, "They used to have a saying that one doesn't have a Chinaman's chance, but they don't say that anymore. They used that expression back when China was weak. But now that Mao Zedong has been successful in making China a strong country, the Chinese have more chance than anybody else. So this saying has become outdated." These are just a few examples of the relationship we recall and celebrate today. In the mid-1980s, I happened to meet a comrade who'd been a member of the then recently dissolved Communist Workers' Party, USA. This party is perhaps best remembered for the murder of 5 of its comrades at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan in Greensboro, North Carolina in November 1979. Reflecting on this special relationship between socialist China and African-American revolutionaries, he noted, "Did the African revolutionary movement support Cuba? Yes, of course it did. But tens of thousands of people in the Black community didn't follow the progress of the Cuban Revolution literally on a daily basis in the way that they did with China. Yet Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai never visited the United States. They never stayed in Harlem, but Fidel Castro and Che Guevara did." One connection is surely the part played by Chinese communists and progressives in the United States in the pre-liberation period. Li Liangguo had taught Robeson the March of the Volunteers. Tang Mingzhao and his daughter Tang Wenchen, also known as Nancy Tang, as well as Ji Jiaochu, were able to provide Mao and Zhou Enlai with first-hand perspectives on the United States, not least on the African-American struggle. As Mao's English language interpreters, Ji and Nancy Tang had access to the chairman on a daily basis. The new China had almost no contact with the United States from 1949 to 71, but the Chinese leadership was surprisingly well informed. So this is part of the story, but in the words of Bob Marley, half the story has never been told. To help remedy that deficit, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston in the US. By my quick calculation, he has written around 40 books, possibly more, and I'm sure many of you must have read at least some of them. Of particular relevance to today's event, they include W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Afro-American Response to the Cold War, Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, and Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Gerald is truly an outstanding, committed, and revolutionary scholar, and it's a great privilege to have him join us today. So, Gerald, please.
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this important webinar. The theme of my brief remarks, and let me first of all apologize for not being able to stay with you for the entire course of this important session. My theme is that the century of humiliation that China endured, coming to a screeching halt in October 1949, was fueled in no small measure by the centuries of humiliation endured by peoples of African descent at the hands and at the behest of what now amounts to the North Atlantic powers. That is to say that the wealth that fueled the rise of the United States, of Great Britain, of France, of Spain, etc., was driven in no small measure by the unlimited African slave trade. Therefore, it's appropriate to suggest that with October 1949 and the end of the century of humiliation, not coincidentally, you begin to see a turnaround with regard to the centuries of humiliation endured by peoples of African descent. That is to say, the wave of decolonization flowing from the end of World War II, the fact that the United States of America more particularly had difficulty in convincing folks in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that it was a paragon of human rights virtue as long as U.S. Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid continued to reign. And therefore, there was a certain confluence between October 1949 and the agonizing retreat of the horrors of U.S. apartheid. But to return to the confluence of these two trends, many in your audience are probably familiar with the fact that in 1871 in Los Angeles, there were anti-Chinese pogroms. At the same time, there were anti-Black pogroms being unleashed in Dixie, in Louisiana, and other parts of the South. You're probably familiar with the fact that in 1882, the United States was moved to install anti-Chinese immigration legislation at the same time that Black Americans were on the path to being denaturalized, that is to say, having their so-called U.S. citizenship being fundamentally a kind of dead letter. By 1885, there were anti-Chinese pogroms in Wyoming at the same time that there once more were anti-Black pogroms throughout Dixie. In 1887, you saw the beginning of the end of the independent Hawaii Kingdom in Honolulu with the onslaught of the so-called Bayonet Constitution, and one of the first measures adopted by the Yankees and the sons and daughters of missionaries who adopted the so-called Bayonet Constitution in Hawaii in 1887 was to say that only those of European descent could vote, which meant that the Bayonet Constitution ensnared not only people of African descent and ensnared people of Chinese descent as well. Likewise, when the coup de grace for the Hawaii Kingdom was exacted in 1893 with the counter-revolutionary coup d'etat, once again organized by the sons and daughters of missionaries, you saw the establishment of an apartheid regime in the Pacific, an apartheid regime in what was to become a territory of the United States, and of course, ultimately a 50th and final state of the United States of America in 1959. And once again, the establishment of this apartheid state in the Pacific was harmful to those of African and Chinese ancestry alike. By 1900, 1901, you have U.S. Marines interfering in the internal affairs of China with the suppression of the so-called Boxer Rebellion. At the same time, we see the escalation of lynchings, the execution of Black people without due process of law on the U.S. mainland. You mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois. You may be familiar with his reaction to the so-called Atlanta riot, actually a pogrom against Black people in 1906. He was horrified, as well he should have been, by the fact that he passed a butcher shop during those tumultuous days. And like so many shanks of beef, there were hanging the limbs of Black people in a butcher shop. But of course, to fast forward, we also know, as I indicated a moment or two ago, that with the triumph of the Chinese Revolution, October 1949, you saw a kind of hysteria that courses through the United States of America as embodied in the Red Scare and the escalation of the Cold War, the escalation of McCarthyism. We see that the United States from 1950 to 1953 waged war on the Korean Peninsula, which brought U.S. and Chinese troops into confrontation. And at the same time, during that period, the aforementioned Paul Robeson was seeking to bring the United States into the dock before the United Nations, charging the United States with genocide against Black people. This was an electrifying maneuver by Mr. Robeson, and his comrades in the Civil Rights Congress and in the U.S. Communist Party. But alas, they had to pay a price for their audacity, with his main comrade, William Patterson, serving a stint in prison, and Mr. Robeson having his passport snatched and placed under a kind of virtual house arrest by the angry and anguished U.S. authorities. Today, of course, we are in the midst of another so-called confrontation across the Pacific between the United States and China. You're probably familiar with this new conglomeration of forces, the Quad, the Squad, AUKUS, that is to say, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, etc., lining up to confront the People's Republic of China. And at the same time, on these shores, you have an escalation of hate crimes against people not only of Chinese ancestry, but of Asian ancestry more generally. And at the same time, the hate crimes against Black people have not ceased to exist, as exhibited by what befell George Floyd in Minnesota a few odd years ago. We also see that there is a bit of good news amongst the gloom and doom. That is to say that the Chinese economy, by many measures, is larger than that of the United States economy. We see China making great strides with regard to green energy, with regard to quantum computing, with regard to space exploration, with regard to knocking together, along with its allies and comrades, the alternative to the Group of Seven led by the United States. I'm speaking of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, complemented by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Simultaneously, it's going to be difficult, although not altogether impossible, I should add, for the United States to pursue Cold War II, given the fact that France and Germany are not on board, as exemplified by President Xi's trip to France just a few days ago, the trip to China of Chancellor Scholz with a plane load of German businessmen just a few weeks ago. The not so good news is that the Black leadership was forced into a debilitating and devastating compromise in the 1950s in order to extract anti-Jim Crow concessions. That is to say, the price for that ticket was tossing overboard the most internationally minded leaders, led by the late, great Paul Robeson. And as a result, we do not have the kind of participation we so desperately need in our community with regard to fighting back against Cold War II. One recommendation I will make is for this grouping to try to organize delegations of a left-center character to travel to China to engage in discourse and discussions with their counterparts in China as a way to corrode the negative impact of Cold War II. And let me conclude with two cautionary notes. Cautionary note one is that you and your audience should know that US historiography is undergoing a great shift right now. If I had time, I would go into more detail. And the great shift involves not necessarily seeing 1776 and the formation of the United States of America as a great leap forward for humanity. I think that this is partially driven by the fact that as students on campuses from the Atlantic Pacific charge Israel with being a settler colonial regime trying to impose genocide, as the International Court of Justice put it, against the Palestinian population, it's dawned on many that what we have in North America is obviously a settler colonial regime that exacted genocide against the indigenous population and mass enslavement of the African population. And it's becoming exceedingly difficult for scholars who are honest to continue to portray 1776 is a great leap forward, when obviously it was not a great leap forward for the indigenous population. And certainly we have known for some time that the African population refused to engage in class collaboration by joining with their slave masters like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to fight against the antagonists of those slave masters. When you adopt a new view of the origins of the United States, it makes it easier, it seems to me, to adopt a more realistic strategy with regard to combating today's US imperialism. The second cautionary note, and I will end on this point, is that I would like to advise our friends in the Chinese American community, our friends in China itself, particularly our friends at China Daily. The latter, of course, unfortunately, had some rather sharp and stinging articles against affirmative action in the state of California when that was on the ballot a few years ago. And of course, it went down to defeat. I think that our friends at China Daily should realize that helping to defeat affirmative action only helped to prop up the right-wing forces who want to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, which of course is the subject of an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the elite journal, published on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And of course, sad to say, many in the Chinese American community, although certainly not all, have continued to carry that torch, which I think is ultimately to their detriment, insofar as it only helps to put wind in the sails of right-wing forces that are bent upon harm to them, just like they have been for decades previously. So with that, I'll close. Once again, thank you very much for your attention. And sadly, I will not be around to hear the other brilliant presentations that are about to be made.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne. That was, I think, a sensational contribution. So comprehensive, sweeping, and encyclopedic that I really hope that obviously this will be available online and people will be able to listen to it again. I was really particularly struck by the mention you made, that the relationship you made between the century of humiliation that the Chinese people talk about with the centuries of humiliation endured by African and indigenous peoples, and also in particular the way you brought out the joint struggles and confluence of the circumstances of African, Chinese, and Hawaiian people in the United States, and again with the Korean War coinciding with Paul Robeson and others seeking to charge the United States with genocide, through to today's confrontation and new Cold War. So thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. Our next speaker, who I'm going to introduce, is Dr. Gai Yunshang. Dr. Gai Yunshang is Professor of History at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. Her research focuses primarily on trans-Pacific cultural history in the 20th century, and she has written 2 books, including the award-winning Arise Africa, Raw China, Black and Chinese Citizens of the World in the 20th Century, published by the University of North Carolina Press in December 2021, and whose theme is highly relevant to the subject of today's webinar. As publicity for the book states, it reveals much earlier and widespread interactions between Sino-African American leftist figures than the familiar alliance between the radicals and the Maoist China. So please, Dr. Gao.
Okay, thank you for having me here. Thank you for organizing this. So what I'm going to talk about today is my book. Things I think fits into the theme today very well. And let me share a screen. I have prepared a little slide, few slides right here. Okay, let's see. Can you hear me all right, everybody? Yeah, okay. So let's go back to the first slide. So as you can see from the cover of this book on the left side, this book covers the lives and political activism of 5 figures. It explores their global interactions, particularly their passage across the murky and sometimes treacherous Trans-Pacific ideological and political landscapes. Okay, so I think for the audiences here and the 3 famous 20th century African American figures, we don't need introduction. I had W.E.B. Du Bois mentioned many times here, and Langston Hughes. And so the other 2 figures here, Liu Liangmo, Liu Liangmo and Si Lanchen, they were once well known, but since have been assigned to the dustbin of history before I rescued them. Okay, so who was Liu Liangmo? He was a talented musician, a prolific journalist, and also a Christian activist. So the brief introduction of him. Sylvia Si Lanchen was a pioneering Sino-Caribbean dancer choreographer who happened to be a daughter of Eugene Chen, a foreign minister of China in the 1920s. And also she was once upon a time a romantic partner of Langston Hughes. Okay, so, and also if you look at this slide here, both Robeson and Paul Robeson considered her the perfect union of Black and Chinese. Okay, so those are some very brief ideas who are those figures covered in my book. Okay, so overall, solidarity of the colored world in their shared destiny of anti-racism and anti-colonialism, and bound these 5 figures together. Okay. And so their political ties, as I illustrated in my book, was based on their profound emotional and intellectual understanding of the Sino-Afro kinship, cultural and racial kinship. And so, for instance, I copied a few quotes for you here from my book. And when Langston Hughes made the epic trip to Shanghai in 1933, and in his autobiography, he wrote about the Chinese. And so for him, the Chinese were a very jolly people, as you can see from this slide here, much like colored folks at home. Okay. And so his sentiment was echoed by Liu Liangmo when he traveled in the United States for a decade during the Second World War, and to talk about China, the suffering of China to the United States. And so he found the same thing about the similarity between the Chinese and African Americans. Okay. And so their ideas, their feelings about their faith in the Sino-Afro cultural and racial kinship were shared by W.E.B. Du Bois. In his earlier writings, he talked about how he felt the Chinese were my physical cousins. Okay, so he further elaborated this idea in a poem he wrote in 1959. The title was I Say into China, published in China Reconstructs. Okay, so this poem was actually dedicated to a Chinese intellectual and official, a writer whose name was Guo. Okay, and so in this poem, as you can see, and Du Bois romantically announced that sun which burned my father's ebony, rolled your limbs in gold, and made us both cousins to the stars. Okay, so therefore, these 5 figures enjoyed a general friendship based on racial solidarity. We talked a lot about here in this webinar already, and also shared anti-racism and anti-colonialism. And so they interacted with one another in different ways. At times, they collaborated and contributed to historical alliances. And at other times, as I mentioned, they fell in and out of love. Okay. And so here, due to limited time, I'm not going to go more in details, but I want to highlight among the many areas of collaboration between Liu Liangmo and Paul Robeson. So how do I move to the next slide? And yeah, here. And was, their contribution to help to globalize the future national anthem for China, and called Qilai. Today, also back then, also in China, called the March of Volunteers. Okay, and so I would like to share with you for a few seconds of Paul Robeson's version of this song before it became the national anthem for China today. So this is from album Liu and Robeson made together with the Chinese laundry people from New York City's Chinatown. Okay.
This is a song
You hear me?
born in the struggle of the brave Chinese people. It begins, Qilai, arise, you who refuse to be bond slave, and ends, Chen Jing, march on. Qilai，不就按所努力的人们，把我们的血肉组成我们新的长城。中华民族到了最危险的时候，每个人被迫着发出最好的号声，起来，起来，起来！我们万众一心，冒着敌船的炮火前进，冒着敌船的炮火前进，前进，前进。Arise, you who refuse to be bond slaves. Let's stand up and fight for liberty and true democracy. All our world is facing the chains of the tyrant. Everyone who works for freedom is now crying. Arise, arise, arise. All of us with one heart, with the torch of freedom, march on. With the torch of freedom, march on, march on, march on and on. Chila.
Okay, I'll stop here. So, what are the major contributions of this book? What readers expect to take from this? I think Dennis already mentioned. Keith already mentioned. I feel this book reveals much earlier and widespread interactions between Chinese and leftist figures, more than the familiar story of the Black radicals and Maoist China. And beyond that, I think it breaks ground in other areas. For instance, when we think about Sino-American relations, scholarship default, they treat U.S. as default white. So I think my book breaks new path by foregrounding African Americans in this discourse. And by doing so, it allows us to reimagine Sino-American relations by decentralizing the story of Kissinger and Nixon, etc., and allows us to imagine Afro-Chinese history as centered to the global history, world history, and also focus on anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and popular movement, which are still very much relevant today. It's another thing. And also this study combines study of Black internationalism with the experience of Chinese and Chinese Americans with a trans-Pacific narrative. Okay, so actually there was one reader who recommends this book on social media and made such a comment. So let me read this. And he wrote, "What Du Bois, Robeson, and Hughes have in common? What if I told you that part of the answer was a deep engagement with China and Chinese Americans. So I thought that was pretty well said. So that's the second point I'd like to make about the contribution of my book. And of course, this process also reveals making and remaking of modern Chinese popular culture and politics through a global process. And it reveals China's transnational entanglement, even in the era commonly perceived as China as isolated, disconnected. Okay, so to conclude, so I think the lives and careers of these 5 figures stand as powerful counters of the narratives that highlight alienation and racism. Okay, and otherwise Africa, raw China, as articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes, respectively, match with the struggles of the nation that refers to China, and a nation within a nation that refers to African Americans. And so their promise and power would resonate beyond today. Okay, and that's all what I have to say today. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gao, thank you so very much indeed for that wonderful presentation that brought to life the important history in your book, and I hope it inspires anyone who hasn't read it to make good that deficit in their reading and to read it. And I certainly look forward to your future work, and thank you as well for giving everybody the opportunity to hear the wonderful voice of Paul Robeson. And I know that you have a busy day today ahead of you, so thank you also for sparing your time. It's really nice to have had you on here and to get to know you, at least on Zoom. Thank you very much indeed. And our next speaker will be Dr. Sharice Berden. Sharice is the Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University in the United States, and her published works include Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, and W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, which she co-authored with Gerald Horne. She is also co-author with Jody Dean of the recent Verso title, Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing. Subjects of the book include such outstanding friends of China as Vicky Garvin and Claudia Jones. According to Verso, the book highlights the link between communism and Black liberation. Likewise, it makes clear how Black women fundamentally shaped and were shaped by communist praxis in the 20th century. Sharice is also a member of Black Alliance for Peace. So, Sharice, please.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. I'm going to speak a bit about W.B. Du Bois today, specifically his indictment in 1951, and some of the implications we can take from that particular happening, as well as Chinese support for Du Bois during that time, and vice versa. In 1951, W.B. Du Bois was indicted as an agent of a foreign power for chairing the Peace Information Center, and more specifically, for their circulation of the Stockholm Peace Appeal or the Ban the Bomb petition. As Du Bois explained in his understudied work in Battle for Peace, The Story of My 83rd Birthday, a book, by the way, I recommend that everybody read, the Peace Information Center was first attacked just 2 months after its formation by Secretary of State Dean Acheson on July 12, 1950. He called the Stockholm Peace Appeal a propaganda trick of the Soviet Union, thereby implying that those who circulated it were doing the bidding of the United States' staunchest enemy. In his reply to Acheson on July 14th, Du Bois not only defended the appeal as something that scores of world leaders had signed onto and millions around the world believed in, but also made the connection between aggression against China, the subjection of Black people in the United States, and anti-communism. He wrote, quote, We have got to live in the world with Russia and China. If we worked together with the Soviet Union against the menace of Hitler, can we not work with them again at a time when only faith can save us from utter atomic disaster? Certainly hundreds of millions of colonial people in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, conscious of our support of Chiang Kai-shek, Bao Dai, and the colonial system, and mindful of the oppressive discrimination against the Negro people in the United States, would feel that our intentions also must be accepted on faith. Today in this country, it is becoming standard reaction to call anything communist and therefore subversive and unpatriotic, which anybody, for any reason, dislikes. We feel strongly that this tactic has already gone too far, that it is not sufficient today to trace a proposal to a communist source in order to dismiss it with contempt, end quote. Given Du Bois's adamant defense of China's self-determination, it is no surprise that comrades there were some of the first to come to his aid after he and other PIC members were indicted. They sent messages of support and signed on to the International Committee in Defense of W.E.B. Du Bois and his colleagues. Articles were published about his case in the Shanghai China News. Organizations like the All China Students Federation wrote letters of protest to the US government. And in fact, Du Bois wrote that, quote, China knew of our plight before California, end quote. This was due in part to the strength of his international connections and because his New York-based Defense Committee understood the importance of globalizing this struggle. Here, they had the cases of the Scottsboro Boys, Rosalie Ingram, and many others as models. Such solidarity was remarkable since, as Du Bois noted, conquerors, including the United States, used the conquered to entrench their own immiseration and that of others. This was meant to preclude mutual comradeship among the racialized, colonized, and oppressed. He explained, quote, today France is using the Black Senegalese to conquer Vietnam, and Britain has used troops of every race and hue to hold the remains of her empire. Perhaps worst of all today is the use of American Negro troops in Korea. Not only is this bound to leave a legacy of hate between yellow nations and Black, but the effect on the Negroes of America at being in a sense compelled to murder colored folks who suffer from the same race prejudice that Negroes in the United States have long suffered and still suffer, at being almost forced to be the dumb tools of business corporations seeking to dominate China and Asia. This is bound to result in the exacerbation of prejudice and inner conflict here in America, end quote. Thus, the mutual support between Du Bois and his comrades around the world, including in China, was invaluable to securing what he called interracial peace in a war-torn world. When Du Bois and his partner in life and struggle, Shirley Graham Du Bois, set out on a national speaking tour to raise awareness about his case among USians generally, and Black folks particularly, Du Bois made sure to lift up U.S. warmongering and aggression against China and the Soviet Union as the basis for the repressive atmosphere that led to his indictment. He explained, quote, the world is astonished at recent developments in the United States. Our actions and attitudes are discussed with puzzled wonder on the streets of every city in the world. Reluctantly, the world is coming to believe that we actually want war, that we must have war. It is American investors that seek to dominate China, India, Korea, and Burma, and who are throttling the starved workers of the Near East, the Caribbean, and South America. Today, in this free country, no man can be sure of earning a living, of escaping slander and personal violence, or even of keeping out of jail unless publicly and repeatedly he proclaims that he hates Russia. He opposes socialism and communism. He supports wholeheartedly the war in Korea. He is ready to spend any amount for further war, anywhere or at any time. He is ready to fight the Soviet Union, China, and any other country or all countries together, end quote. These connections emanated from Du Bois's keen understanding that his indictment was meant to prevent U.S. citizens from critiquing big business and U.S. imperialism, not least their efforts to make Asia a subservient colony subsidiary of U.S. industry, not least their efforts to make Asia a subservient colonial subsidiary of U.S. industry, to expropriate African land, labor, and resources, to entrench U.S. control in the Caribbean and South America, and most of all, to crush socialism in the Soviet Union and in China. So I want to end by talking about some relevant takeaways from China's defense of Du Bois during his indictment and Du Bois's condemnation of U.S. warmongering in China and elsewhere. Not least because many of Du Bois's words about the anti-communist or anti-radical environment, about the saber rattling with China and Russia, about the repression of Black activism, really resonate with our current historical moment. So one of the takeaways is the imperative of waging internationalist campaigns against injustice, repression, and genocide, which of course relates directly to what's happening in Gaza right now, in Rafah, and that has been happening for the past 60 or since 1948, but has been intensified since October 7th. And here, relationship building is paramount to avoid abstract or facile proclamations of solidarity without any real material action. And this is something that Du Bois really conveys through the trips that he took to China, but also in his ongoing defense of the Chinese Revolution, of Chinese self-determination, and his ongoing correspondence with Chinese comrades, keeping abreast of what was happening in China, and in turn letting them know what was happening with the Black freedom struggle. The second takeaway is that war is the basis of so much of the world's ills, so we have to strive for peace no matter the cost. And as the Black Alliance for Peace explains, following the example of Du Bois and the radical Black peace tradition, peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict, nuclear armament and proliferation, unjust war, and subversion through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. So here we're not talking about a kumbaya pacifism, but rather the struggle for the ending of all interlocking forms of domination. And it's only through this struggle that peace can be achieved. And Du Bois certainly understood this. Another takeaway is that hostile U.S. foreign policy is directly related to the domestic vitriol. And we see this, right, with, on the one hand, U.S. xenophobia is the direct material foundation of the anti-Asian violence that we saw peak during, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also see that support for Israel is leading to increased Islamophobia and anti-Palestine racism here. And so Du Bois understood, as we ought to understand now, that there is a imbrication or a mutual co-constitutionality of U.S. foreign policy and warmongering and the violence and racism and dispossession that happened domestically. Another takeaway is that attacks on China by the U.S. are part of a broader policy of global domination that finds world war preferable to multipolarity. And that current xenophobia, manifested in various outside agitator discourses levied at anything from the campus protests to anti-war organizing. We saw this attack on various peace organizations in the New York Times, to Black uprisings during 2020, the claim that they were funded by China and Russia, and that they were full of outside agitators. But this is part of a much longer history of U.S. hostility toward China and the potential for Chinese Black solidarity and international solidarity more broadly. Another takeaway is that Black liberation requires international allies, especially those that are antagonistic to U.S. imperialism. And Black folks in the United States must in turn be in real material solidarity with struggles happening elsewhere. It is imperative that we engage in political education so that we do not believe State Department propaganda about places like China and Russia. And finally, belonging to organizations and collectives are invaluable to defense against state repression, because as we see, it was organizations that helped in China and elsewhere that helped to defend W.E.B. Du Bois and to internationalize his struggle. It was all of these committees that were formed in his defense that ultimately allowed Du Bois to be acquitted, right? So we can't rely on the capitalist courts, the imperialist courts to give us justice. We can only rely on building a mass movement and being part of organizations, and that is the basis of building mass movement. So I will stop there and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharice. Your account of the early, the very early solidarity that China displayed with Dr. Du Bois at the time of his indictment is really fascinating and inspiring. And as you said, the marvelous quote you brought that China heard about it before California. I'd also just pick out your how the excellent way that you clarified the true meaning of what peace means and what it needs to consist of and what it needs to accomplish it, and the importance of organizations. So thank you so much. And I'm sure I and many others look forward to your next and forthcoming books and articles. Thank you so much. Next, I want to introduce our good friend Charles Zhou, who is speaking on behalf of the Chao Collective. The Chao Collective is a diaspora Chinese media collective that challenges US aggression on China. One of its stated aims is to be a bridge between the US left and China's rich Marxist anti-imperialist political work, an aim which I think is greatly in accord with our event today. We're always very grateful for Charles and Chao Collective support. So thank you, Charles. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that very generous introduction. Thank you as well to all the listeners, to Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group for organizing this event, and also to all my fellow panelists for their outstanding contributions. As Keith mentioned at the start of this webinar, we're gathered here today to mark the 65th anniversary of W.E.B. Du Bois' visit to China, during which he delivered a speech at Beida, at Peking University, on his 91st birthday, which is very much worth reading in full. It's been published on the Friends of Socialist China website, and I'll drop a link to it in the chat. Or someone else can do so first. This speech is notable for a number of reasons, one of which is that it ties together two strands of Dr. Du Bois' work that are too often examined in isolation or treated as contradictory. The first is his vocal solidarity with China and the USSR, including so-called revolutions from above and the armed suppression of counter-revolution, topics which, of course, are quite controversial, especially in Western left political discourse. And the second strand is, of course, Dr. Du Bois's careful study of the Black liberation struggle during the US Civil War and Reconstruction, as encapsulated in his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America. Now, I contend that these two strands are, in fact, not just inseparable, but for Du Bois, that the former, his internationalist solidarity with socialist revolutions and with, indeed, the violence that is often necessary to defend them, is actually firmly grounded in his understanding and his careful study of the latter. So looking at the speech itself, there are a number of passages that draw this connection, directly or indirectly. To quote, speaking of China, he said that he spoke as follows, quote, "Behold a people, the most populous nation on this ancient earth, which has burst its shackles, not by boasting and strutting, not by lying about its history and its conquests, but by patience and long suffering, by blind struggle, moved up and on towards the crimson sky. She aims to make men holy, to make men free." That last line, of course, is taken directly from the Civil War era abolitionist anthem, Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is based on the even more militant anthem, John Brown's Body. Elsewhere in the speech, he does warn against this myopic focus on revolutionary violence to the exclusion of social transformations, and again draws an analogy here with US history. He said that, quote, "The essence of the revolution in the Soviet Union and China and in all the Iron Curtain nations is not the violence that accompanied the change, no more than starvation at Valley Forge was the essence of the American Revolution against Britain." End quote. Nonetheless, in his writings on the USSR and China, Dr. Du Bois did prove fully willing to accept the necessity for such violence in the face of potential counter-revolution. And in so doing, he took positions that are today quite historically contentious, especially on the Western left. For example, in a speech that he gave in 1956 entitled "The Theory of Hungary," regarding the Soviet intervention in Hungary that occurred shortly before, he wrote the following, quote, "If before such an onslaught Hungary fell to fascism, then all that terrific effort which had just overthrown Hitler would have been in vain. All of that struggle for socialism, which lasted from 1917 to 1945, against the most powerful nations of the world, would have gone down the drain. The Third World War would have begun. It was the crisis of the 20th century. To the glory of the future of mankind, the Soviet Union rose to the occasion and won for Hungary freedom to build socialism in its own time and its own way," end quote. Pretty striking words, considering that that event is in fact the origin of the pejorative moniker "tanky" for principled anti-imperialists in the Western left. But I would add that it's hard not to imagine that in writing this, Dr. Du Bois had in mind, in fact, another historical episode, namely the violent end of Reconstruction. The period that marked the closest the United States has ever come to a bona fide social revolution in its own territory, and which was violently crushed at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan and its allies. Indeed, the analogies run quite deep between the US Civil War and especially the Eastern Front of World War II, and subsequently as well between the processes of Reconstruction in the US South and of socialist construction during the Cold War in the Eastern Bloc. And this is vitally important to remember, I think, so soon after May 9th, the anniversary of victory over Nazism in Europe, at a time when that historical memory is more distorted and contested than ever, not just in Eastern Europe where the battle took place, but throughout the NATO countries. So to wit, these are, I think, some of the important similarities between the two processes, which I'm sure did not escape W.E.B. Du Bois's attention either. One was that both wars, the Civil War and World War II in Europe, resulted in the destruction of political economic regimes that were founded on extreme forms of racial domination. Of course, chattel slavery in the US South and Nazism in Europe. Another similarity is that in the post-war period, the reconstruction of the US South and the rebuilding of Eastern Europe were both social revolutions that were intended to abolish the material and the ideological foundations for slavery and fascism at a breakneck pace. They were also predominantly revolutions from above, so to speak, implemented largely by a progressive minority that was empowered to govern populations that have been conditioned by centuries of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, respectively. And in both cases, these empowered progressive minorities were ultimately backed by the military might of liberating armies that were in many ways perceived as foreign by the occupied populations, namely the Union Army after the Civil War and the Red Army in Eastern Europe. Over the course of their historical development, both revolutionary processes were ultimately defeated by counter-revolution. And in a particular way that I think is understudied. Namely, both of these counter-revolutions, the one in 1877 that ended Reconstruction in the US, and the one that overthrew socialism in the Eastern Bloc in 1989 to 91, what they did was they united whites in cross-class alliances that were fundamentally sutured by white supremacy and across geographical divides. The North-South divide in the United States in 1877 and the East-West divide in Europe in 1989. And furthermore, both of those defeats paved the way for accelerated US imperialism, principally continental imperialism after the defeat of Reconstruction, and then global US imperialism in the multipolar era, in the unipolar era, which is thankfully now coming to a close after the end of the Cold War. So, we've explored this analogy in depth in the case of Dr. Du Bois's writings on Eastern Europe and in particular Hungary. The thing is that, his well-informed embrace of this need for so-called revolution from above, when revolution from below is insufficient on its own, extended also to China. And specifically, an event that occurred just weeks after his speech, his aforementioned speech in 1959, namely the liberation of Tibet from serfdom and theocratic rule, which occurred with the help of the People's Liberation Army. To wit, in a speech that Dr. Du Bois gave in 1960 entitled Socialism and the American Negro, he said the following with regards to China and Tibet in particular. Quote, "Perhaps our most unforgivable deed today is our attitude toward China. We hate China. We propose never to forgive the Chinese. We count them outside humanity. We charge them with every crime we can invent. I was on the borders of Tibet last year when China saved the Tibetan slaves, and we shed crocodile tears. We have sympathy and money for the slave drivers who hold the Dalai Lama as prisoner," end quote. And I think in this last line in particular, his considered use of the term slave drivers is very notable, especially as it alludes directly to an earlier reference in the same speech that referred specifically to racialized chattel slavery in the U.S. Again, as a regime of horrific domination that was ended through a combination of bona fide social revolution and through military intervention. I want to sort of conclude with the following thought, which is to recall that Dr. Du Bois was visiting Beijing in 1959 as an honored guest of the Chinese government. And we must recognize that this is just one expression of the fact that the latter, the government of China, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, reciprocated the support of Dr. Du Bois and so many other Black revolutionaries for their revolutionary project by supporting in turn the incipient Black-led revolution from below in the United States, including its most radical and militant expressions. As Keith mentioned at the start of this webinar, Chairman Mao, in April of 1968, in a speech entitled "A New Storm Against Imperialism," said the following, quote, "Some days ago, Martin Luther King, the Afro-American clergyman, was suddenly assassinated by the US imperialists. Martin Luther King was an exponent of nonviolence. Nevertheless, the US imperialists did not on that account show any tolerance toward him, but used counter-revolutionary violence and killed him in cold blood. This has taught the broad masses of Black people in the United States a profound lesson. It has touched off a new storm in their struggle against violent repression, sweeping well over 100 cities in the United States, a storm such as has never taken place before in the history of that country. It shows that an extremely powerful revolutionary force is latent in the more than 20 million Black Americans," end quote. Notably, just a week after that speech by Mao, as part of this new storm of struggle, the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia University in New York led an occupation of Hamilton Hall. This was in protest directly of Columbia's complicity in Vietnam War research and in the gentrification and displacement of the Black population of Harlem. This famous occupation lasted for a week before its violent eviction by NYPD. And notably, the president of the Student Afro-American Society at that time, Raymond Brown, recalled later in an interview in 2018 that, quote, "Chairman Mao sent us a telegram pledging solidarity to the Black students of Hamilton Hall." The contents of this telegram I've not been able to dig up, so any assistance regarding that would be very much appreciated. Nonetheless, I think that this historical episode is very worth remembering, considering that 56 years later to the day, Columbia students, of course, demanding an end, this time to Zionist occupation and genocide in Palestine, once again occupied Hamilton Hall, renaming it Hind's Hall, in honor of the martyred 60-year-old Palestinian girl, Hind Rajab. And through this and the preceding encampment, Columbia again became the catalyst for a student uprising in this country, unprecedented in scale since 1968, which has transfixed the attention of the world on the revolutionary anti-imperialist struggle of the US youth for the first time in generations. Now, we've all seen, of course, the incredibly moving images of material and verbal solidarity with US student revolutionaries from their counterparts on the front lines of the resistance in Palestine, Yemen, and elsewhere in the region. But I want to conclude by noting that Chinese social media as well have been awash with images of the US student revolt, whose scale and timing have drawn inevitable comparisons to yet another recent anniversary, one with great historical significance, namely the May 4th movement of 1919. And considering that that movement became in many ways the nucleus of the Chinese Revolution, which triumphed in 1949 and whose triumph extends today, I think that comparison from so many millions of Chinese, whose eyes are transfixed on what's happening in the United States right now, is both a weighty responsibility for this movement and an inestimable honor. And it stands, of course, in a long and illustrious historical tradition of anti-imperial solidarity extending both ways across the Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles, for that brilliant contribution with its profound dialectical sweep that leaves us with so much to think about, particularly your comparisons of following on from what Dr. Du Bois had to say about Hungary in 1956, your comparison of the Reconstruction period in the United States with the four decades, just over 4 decades from 1945 to 1989-91 of what happened in Eastern Europe, and the common thread of white supremacism that derailed the revolution in both those places across continents and centuries. Similarly, with your comments about Tibet, it's I think not surprising that many of the articles that China has published over the years on what they call Serf Emancipation Day in Tibet make the comparison with the anti-slavery struggle in the United States, and that, as you brought out, is a comparison that was certainly not lost on Du Bois. Obviously, what you said about Hamilton Hall is redolent to all of us at this moment, as well as about the May 4th movement. Myself and one of our later speakers, Margaret, among others, were in the Red Building in Beijing just a few weeks ago, and we saw where so much of the impetus for the May 4th movement came from. So thank you very much, and I really hope to read more of this work that you've outlined today in one of your articles. It was really fascinating to hear. Thanks a lot. Our next speaker is Dr. Xiang Fanglu, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Africana Research Center of Pennsylvania State University in the United States. He is the author of Redrawing the Balance of Power, Black Left Feminists, China, and the Making of an Afro-Asian Political Imaginary, 1949 to 1976. That's his PhD thesis, and it's due shortly to be published as a book, which will explore how Black leftist women's understandings of race, class, gender, sexuality, and empire evolved as they sought Afro-Chinese solidarity within often difficult Cold War political contexts. Dr. Liu, please.
Hello. Such a pleasure to be here. I want to echo my co-panelists in thanking the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to share some of my work and to be in conversation with the scholars I have long admired. So in what follows, I will offer a consideration of what lessons the history of African-American radicals, and in particular, Black left feminists' engagements with China, which my current book explores, holds for today's activists. So my book project argues that traveling to China and residing there for extended periods of time enabled Black radical activists to observe and participate actively in anti-imperialist and revolutionary movements, expand their networks, refine and redefine their ideas, and harness the Chinese government's immense resources and anti-imperialist commitments, but at the same time made it more difficult to disentangle their visions of liberation from that of Beijing, shaped by and in service to its own domestic and geostrategic interests. Moreover, although African-American radicals and the Chinese Communist Party worked together to forge Afro-Asian anti-imperialist solidarities, their collaborations were often fraught with disagreements, sometimes expressed and other times subtle. So these stories of ideological cross-pollination, of agreements and disagreements, I hope might be useful to contemporary internationalist activists who also seek to work across racial and national lines and have to navigate the often muddy and turbulent waters of international politics. First of all, we need to center feminist, queer, and radical visions of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist solidarity. Black radical activists forged Afro-Asian alliances to undo overlapping violent systems such as racial capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. For them, their point of entry, a departure, was an inquiry into how such global structures interacted to produce and perpetuate unfreedom for the exploited and the oppressed the world over, rather than simply a focus on individual harm that sidelined analyses of the operations of imperialism and colonialism. They aim to reorient public perspectives away from activist projects within the modern nation state and the promotion of liberal reformism toward transnational radical emancipatory designs. So Black radicals' engagements with China's socialist construction were linked to their efforts to support other emancipatory movements, including the Palestinian liberation struggle. And solidarity with African-American activists was part of China's proletarian internationalist foreign policy. So this commitment to undermining global capitalism and imperialism and creating a just world order should continue to be the hallmark of today's activism. Furthermore, Black radicals, including in particular Black radical women, played crucial roles in the history of Afro-Asian solidarity. While acknowledging and celebrating Black women activists' contributions, we should also appreciate how difficult it was for them to completely break out of the dominant epistemic and political straitjacket of their time. They bumped up against prevailing notions of gender and sexuality, even as they were often complicit in reinforcing normative masculinist discourses and power structures. This means that we should not only uncover and center the formulations of the radical Black female subject that did challenge the hegemony of heteronormative notions of gender and sexuality, we should also remain in conversation with feminist and queer scholar activists in order to better discern the complexities and contradictions of internationalist thought and praxis. Second, Black radicals' successes and challenges of negotiating differences while building solidarities resonate with today's internationalists committed to weaving together multiple radical traditions. The Chinese Communist Party and Black radicals enacted a political and intellectual traffic that flowed both ways. Not only did China's upholding of anti-imperialist internationalism and promotion of the Maoist blueprint for global transformation inflect African diasporic radical intellectual traditions, but the transmission of Black radicals' work into the Chinese public sphere and their embrace of the Chinese Communist Party's ideas also shaped perceptions of the relationship between class, gender, race, and empire, and articulations of socialism, feminism, anti-colonialism, and cosmopolitanism in China. We should therefore remind ourselves that internationalism occurs on a bilateral, if not multilateral basis. But at the same time, certain notions central to Black radical thought did not translate into the context of China's socialist construction. Moreover, the Chinese Communist Party sometimes stretched the analytical scope of Mao Zedong's theory of revolutionary struggle and sought to convince Black radicals of its applicability. In turn, Black radicals were not always able to square their analyses with Maoist precepts and provided discordant responses. Third, Black radicals forged Afro-Asian alliances as vehicles for anti-capitalist and decolonial global transformation in the interest of the wretched of the earth, and more than any nation-state's instruments for pursuing domestic and international interests. They selectively drew on Chinese Communist Party's ideas to craft independent voices, and in other cases, articulated political and ideological positions that diverged from those promoted by the party state. Ensnared within a messy network of cooperation, competition, and conflict among anti-colonial countries and socialist countries, Black radicals occasionally registered their reluctance to pick sides or attempted to paper over ideological and political disagreements. Such discrepancies between Black radicals' revolutionary blueprints and China's vision of national and global transformation sometimes were symptoms of miscommunication and misunderstanding that arose as a result of language barriers, cultural differences, the former's limited exposure to Chinese history and politics. At other times, the gaps reflected conscious efforts to really charge an independent path. Whether they departed from the CCP's lines intentionally or not, Black radicals consistently attempted to forge ahead with their own agendas in alliance with, but not in subordination to any nation state. It is therefore necessary for today's activists and scholars to continue to explore how to navigate the treacherous waters of the domestic politics of nation states and the rapids of regional and global political and social change, and to transcend contexts of competing national interests and geopolitical calculations. In particular, at present, China's economic and political ambitions might be enlisted to redraw the global balance of power in favor of the global South. Today's activists might do well to push China to do away with any trappings of Euro-North American modernity and play a crucial role in the creation of a just world order. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. That was a wonderful talk, and particularly bringing out some of the inevitable contradictions and that have to be navigated in the articulation of a consistent theory and practice of anti-imperialist solidarity. It's very, very thought-provoking, and I hope your book will be available soon. I look forward to reading it. I do read your pieces that appear on Academia, for example, and elsewhere, and always provide so much information and fantastic material. And thank you again for joining us, and hope you can keep in touch. Our final speaker is going to be Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is the executive editor and senior columnist of Black Agenda Report. She is the author of Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents, about which the renowned scholar and a current presidential candidate, Cornel West, wrote, "Margaret Kimberly gives us an intellectual gem or prophetic fire about all the US presidents and their deep roots in the vicious legacy of white supremacy and predatory capitalism. Such truths seem more than most Americans can bear, though we ignore her words at our own peril." Margaret is also a contributor to the anthologies In Defense of Julian Assange, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 on China and the US, and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. And she is a member of the Administrative Committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Coordinating Committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, and the Board of Directors of the US Peace Memorial Foundation. Having worked with Margaret, it was my great pleasure to meet her in person for the first time in China last month, where we both joined the first Friends of Socialist China delegation. And I noted that Dr. Horne, in the first speech of this afternoon, issued effectively a call for us to organise further such delegations, and we would certainly hope to do so. Due to a pre-existing commitment, Margaret has recorded her contribution for today, so we will listen to the recording of Margaret's speech. Thank you.
Greetings, and thank you for joining this Friends of Socialist China webinar. I'm Margaret Kimberly, Executive Editor of Black Agenda Report and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition. I'm honored to participate in this event, and I was honored recently when I was invited to join a Friends of Socialist China delegation, which was hosted by the China NGO Network for International Exchanges, which traveled to Beijing, Hangzhou, and Jiaxing in Xinjiang Province, and Changchun and Saiping in Jilin Province. Not only was it an amazing and inspiring experience, but I felt a connection to those who had gone before me. A connection not only with those who had traveled to China, but to all Black people who struggled to support and defend socialism in the US and around the world. Black socialism was always under attack. The Red Scare and McCarthyism were directed at Black people in a particularly harsh way, and were even used to demonize those who weren't socialists. As we know, Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois had their passports confiscated, and Claudia Jones was deported. Although anyone who was disliked by the white power structure could be labeled a communist, with the understanding that expressing any viewpoint remotely akin to socialism would result in being disappeared from the public sphere. During our delegation visit, we saw museums, historic sites, and hero cities, which brought to life China's amazing history. From being a weakened empire, picked apart by the West, to now being a nation that has emerged as an economic and political rival to those nations which had subjugated it in the past. China suffered from Japan's invasion and millions of deaths in World War II, to the Civil War, to victory in 1949, which was quickly followed by war in Korea. In short, China succeeded in beating the odds and winning and keeping a revolution. I believe that the triumph over these struggles makes the story of the People's Republic of China so appealing to people who have yet to find true liberation. These facts, which create so much admiration for China, also make it a target of attack. It presents the threat of a good example. I visited major cities in China and didn't see anyone living on the street, as I do here in New York or in other major cities in my country. Of course, that doesn't mean that no one is unhoused, but it's an indication of what a nation prioritizes. After all, China has lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty in 40 years. Poverty alleviation is not on the agenda of either of the two duopoly parties in the US. In fact, both are dedicated to increasing austerity and immiseration, just the opposite of what China has dedicated itself to doing. We from the US are very much indoctrinated. We have to make great efforts to be informed about any issue of importance, particularly about countries we are told to fear or to hate. We see that Joe Biden tells China not to aid Russia in the Ukraine proxy war, as if trade with China has caused this tremendous failure, a loss of public money and thousands of lives. The Treasury Secretary then visits to say the Chinese economy was, quote, over capacity, unquote. She was quickly followed by the Secretary of State Blinken, who lectured on human rights and claimed that China was interfering in the presidential election. Blinken had definitely worn out his welcome. If you haven't done so, you should look for the video which shows Xi Jinping waiting to meet him and being impatient and very unhappy about having to do so at all, and expressing happiness about Blinken's departure. While I was in China, the war against the Palestinian people was ongoing, and Israel had bombed an Iranian consulate in Syria. While U.S. politicians made nearly unanimous calls for more war, China advocated restraint. An official statement said, quote, "The crisis highlights the complex dynamics of regional politics and the delicate balance of power in the Middle East. It serves as a reminder of the importance of dialogue, cooperation, and conflict resolution to ensure peace and stability in the region," unquote. A mature and measured response should be the default position of the U.S., but it is just the opposite. Politicians and the media have much to say, none of it complimentary, about what they call the Chinese Communist Party, what they call the CCP. But there's only a CPC, Communist Party of China. It says quite a lot that the propaganda requires the use of a made-up name in order to sustain public antipathy towards another nation. It is both eye-opening and sobering to leave the U.S. and visit nations in which socialists have attained state power, especially in this moment. As a U.S. presidential election approaches, we are once again reminded that the political system will permit no request for change. The most minimal reforms are rejected outright, while the people's money is used to continue the failed Ukraine project and to support Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. The precarity experienced by millions of people is explained away as a figment of their collective imagination. There is rarely a call for making even modest changes, much less revolutionary change, as happened in the People's Republic of China. I watched from afar as corruption in the U.S. was laid bare. I observed a $95 billion giveaway from members of Congress, including $61 billion to the military-industrial complex for the Ukraine proxy war, which has already been lost to Russia. The apartheid state of Israel was also a recipient of $26 billion, and $8 billion was allocated to antagonize China over Taiwan, an island that the U.S. officially acknowledges as being part of China. It was a surreal experience, as the great distance brought all the ugliness into high relief. While members of Congress referred to the conservative post-Soviet leader Vladimir Putin as a communist KGB thug and a murderous Marxist dictator, yes, they really said that, China counseled peace. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who repeated that peace talks are the only reasonable solution to the Ukraine crisis. China has offered its services in an effort to end the bloodshed ever since the proxy war began, but it has been rebuffed at every turn. China is treated as a hostile irrelevancy when it has 18% of the world's population and the world's second largest economy. That's why it's treated with such hostility by a country that only knows how to dominate, for whom cooperation is anathema. We must also say that racism is an element in the hostility. The U.S. deeply resents that a country of non-white people are challenging it at every turn. In this moment, it's clear that revolution is the only hope for the world. The U.S. is attacking its own citizens, telling outrageous lies about the young people who have taken up the charge of demanding divestment from apartheid Israel. The police are being used to stop dissent, as they did during the post-World War I Palmer raids and the McCarthy era, and during the days of the FBI counterintelligence program and the wars on crimes wars on crime and drugs, all used to punish Black people and those who refuse to censor themselves. W.E.B. Du Bois said, quote, "Fantastic tales of the failure of socialism and the impossibility of communism fill our periodicals and books. Most Americans today are convinced that socialism has failed or will fail in the near future," unquote. He said these words more than 60 years ago, and they are true today. Even Cuba, devastated by years of economic coercive measures, provides for the needs of its people. Socialism has not failed, and China proves it. But here in what we call the belly of the beast, we are called upon to be courageous. But we do not have a choice in the matter. We see the beginnings of full-blown repression, and we must prepare ourselves with study and with organization. China has many lessons to teach. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Margaret, for that. I, as it was a pre-recording, I already sent my thanks to Margaret, but I'm sure people will have found her reflections extremely interesting, including about the visit that we made to China together just a few weeks ago. We have a little bit of time. We have some time left for question and answer and discussion. And we have I think three of our speakers are still able to be here in person. Before we move on to that, I'd like to first of all ask Professor Radhika Desai to briefly introduce about one of the co-organizers of this meeting, the International Manifesto Group. So.
Myself. Okay, thanks so much, Keith. I just want to take a couple of minutes to tell you about the International Manifesto Group, which if you are interested in talks like these and webinars, some of you are familiar with the webinars we put up. We are very easily found at www.internationalmanifesto.org. And at that website, you can read our manifesto. You can join the manifesto group. You can sign up for our newsletters and so on. And of those of our companion websites, you can volunteer, donate, and more generally explore what our activities. Our manifesto is already translated into many languages, and so please feel free also, if you agree with it, consider signing it, consider volunteering, consider donating, and let's expand this network of people who are interested in building an anti-imperialist left. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I just now ask my co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, Carlos Martinez, to say a few words about our work.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Yeah, just quickly, Friends of Socialist China was set up almost exactly 3 years ago with the purpose of building understanding of Chinese socialism, of building solidarity, building people-to-people links, and of opposing a reckless and escalating new Cold War that ultimately serves nobody but the sort of better dead than red nutcases in Washington. On our website, socialistchina.org, we try to consolidate, promote, and introduce the best material on China. To date, we've posted, I think, around 1,200 articles. We've held almost 20 webinars and in-person events exploring important themes related to China. We've had speakers including former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, Venezuelan Minister Carlos Ron. We've had prominent Chinese academics such as Cheng Fu, Zhang Weiwei, Victor Gao, and many other excellent journalists, academics, politicians, and activists. And as Keith mentioned, I think earlier, our work took a big step forward this year with our first delegation of 14 comrades from Britain, Ireland, and the US, visiting China, learning more about Chinese Marxism, learning more about the Chinese path to modernization. So please do check out our website, socialistchina.org, sign up to our weekly newsletter, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. And we look forward to hearing from you and to working with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos. We've got two hands up. I'll take Yuri first, please. If you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Is Dr. CBS gone, unfortunately, or?
I haven't checked. I don't know offhand.
Yes, she had to leave.
Okay. Well, then, my question then is to okay, I have two quick questions then to Charles. Then, my first question is: does Charles believe that it's long overdue that the Western left and, to a large degree, even the global left, move beyond anti-communist leftism? And seeing as you're based in the United States, what do you think it's going to take for the broad people power movements in the U.S. to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Native Alaskans? Thank you.
Thank you. As we have one other hand up at the moment, Jeffrey, I propose to take him first, and then Charles and anybody else can respond, if that's okay. So, Jeffrey, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
This is a true or false question, actually. So, just because they supported the revolution doesn't mean they supported Mao Zedong's atrocities that he committed in China, correct? Or incorrect? True or false? True or false?
Well, that was an interesting question. It's with a somewhat loaded turn of phrase. So I'll see Yuri's questions were presented to Charles. I'd like to ask if Charles would like to respond.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I with regards to your first question, Yuri, on the sort of anti-communist bent of a lot of the U.S. based and more generally Western left, it's always been long past time, I would say, for the left at large to move beyond that. I think sort of the more interesting question is to examine why it is that it's been afflicted by this ideological tendency, which I might add is one in some ways reflected by the second questioner and the turn of phrase used, with regards to socialist policy in China there, right? So yeah, I mean there are a lot of sort of the standard explanations, right, regarding the creation of like a privileged stratum of the U.S. working class, a so-called labor aristocracy, right, which takes on particularly racialized dimensions and acts sort of to internally fracture the possibility of broad working class internationalism in the United States. And this, has sort of been exploited to the hilt, by the forces of counter-revolution, counterinsurgency in the U.S., both in order to undermine internal cohesion within the left along racial lines, along other internal strata dividing the working class, and to undermine the basis of internationalism and anti-imperialism in the same way, right? And for that reason, I think it's vitally important to draw the kinds of connections that we're seeing, in this very webinar between. Sorry, someone unmuted. Okay. Yes, between those struggles that I would say are at the vanguard of anti-racist and anti-colonial, or those movements that are at the vanguard of anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles domestically in the United States, and their counterparts, national liberation struggles for sovereignty and self-determination against U.S. imperialism at a world scale. And I would say that by and large it is, with some exceptions, it is the same fractions of the left that are most militantly, pushing in both directions. And you know, in many ways, this pertains, I think, to your second question regarding specifically the question of indigenous liberation and self-determination on Turtle Island, where you know, I think what we're seeing now with the breadth and sustained popularity and militancy of the movement in solidarity with Palestine is a real deepening of understanding and analysis, particularly in younger generations of the left. You know, regarding the material basis of Zionist settler colonialism and a really considered understanding as well, I think, of its parallels and the inspiration that it draws from U.S. settler colonialism. In many ways, you know, most of the encampments that have sprung up over the course of this movement in the last few weeks have expressly, you know, not just identified themselves rhetorically with the Native liberation struggle here in North America, but in fact have branded themselves as deoccupations of land that was ipso facto occupied by, you know, universities, but by their home universities, right, as essentially arms of you know, the U.S. and Canadian settler colonial projects. There was one interesting example as well. I forget exactly where Native peoples actually put out a statement embracing and legitimizing, you know, the encampment on their unceded territory. You know, in I think a really moving instance of this kind of material solidarity between struggles against settler colonialism. So, you know, there's a deeply intertwined dialectic there between, I think, the limitations of the Western left in these regards and the promise that this movement holds, you know, in terms of healing that rupture and bringing the broad masses of you know, the United States, led by a reinvigorated and younger generation of the left, into full solidarity with the peoples of the global South, as well as internally colonized peoples here in the United States, in a common struggle to destroy U.S. imperialism.
Thanks very much, Charles. I see Joe Kelly has got his hand up. Before I ask Joe to speak, I'd just like to thank him for it was actually Joe sending a YouTube video of the short Chinese documentary film of Dr. Du Bois' visit in 1963 that actually was the spark that resulted in today's webinar. So it was really Joe's idea. Thank you very much, Joe. If you'd like to speak now.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points of emphasis that come out of the discussion. One is that Du Bois's move towards communism in the 50s and 60s, the one event that counts as an important point of turning point for him would have been the anti-Korean War movement, which was mentioned by one of the speakers. And he was a leading fighter in that movement. He was a leading, along with Paul Robeson, and they were suppressed, right, heavily. Both Paul and Du Bois. Eventually, Du Bois had to leave the United States. So that's important to keep in mind, that it was the Korean. It wasn't just hatred of Black people, hatred of, you know, communists in the abstract. It was directly related to the U.S. Involvement in the Korean War. So the second thing I want to emphasize is that there's one of the speakers mentioned, you know, divisions and contradictions between Black nationalists and China or whatever, right? In terms of international solidarity. But what I want to say is our expectations of solidarity, international solidarity, shouldn't be like the idea that there's one narrative, you know, within that solidarity, particularly when you have a situation where some of the, you know, like a successful socialist revolution means a successful state, and the state and movements will tend to have some tensions. And I'll tell you, one of the best examples of how that was managed was the first few congresses of the Comintern in Russia. And you could see that, like, for example, the Comintern was the first left organization to have a position as anti-Zionist position, right? It was tabled. Of course, it was debated, and I think the way that was dealt with wasn't like Lenin or Trotsky saying, "Hey, you have to have this position or that position." It was like voted on. It was tabled. It was voted on. Sometimes it would be tabled from comrades from India or black comrades from the US, like with the Soviet position on the black question, if you want to put it that way. Even in terms of what the South African Communist Party would do, the positions they would take on nationalism, black nationalism. So they would debate that and table positions, and those would become, if the parties accept it and how they interpret it in their own practice, is another story. The Comintern didn't dominate and say, "Hey, you have to do it that way." So those kind of divisions are normal and expected. Especially also, you have to understand, once you have a state, the state is also more interested in preserving itself against imperialism. It's not so much going to come and lead your fight. So you're going to have that tension. You know what I mean? And lastly, for example, Cuba in Africa, it helped win the Angolan national liberation struggle, and thereby help fight apartheid. And in the process, in order to do that, Castro had to take an independent position in relation to the Soviet Union. It literally had to push the Soviet Union to sustain its support for his war against racism in Angola, racism and colonialism in Angola. And the Soviet Union did support, but it had to be, Castro had to take a number of initiatives to push them. That's all I'm saying. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Zhou. I think two books come to mind from three books come to mind from what you said on the last point about Cuba and Africa, Conflicting Missions by Glaisis, and also Isaac Saney's book, Africa's Children Return. And on your very interesting point about the Korean War, Iskra Press, hope people can look it up. Iskra Press have published an important book detailing the writings of Claudia Jones, who's been mentioned today, the writings of Claudia in opposition to the Korean War. So there's three good books to follow on from your very, very interesting comments. Obviously, a lot of other interesting books could be mentioned arising from your short but very, very useful contribution. I don't see anybody else's hand up just at the moment, and we okay. I see you spoken once, but I'll let you go again. And as I don't see anybody,
wonder if you're going to answer my question or not.
Well, I don't know who you were posing the question to.
Well, anyone.
Well, I think that your question presupposes that Mao was guilty of atrocities. I don't accept the premise of your question.
His premises killed thousands of people, millions actually.
I'm sorry, I don't accept the premise of your question, and I don't think this is the place to have a dialogue about it any further.
It'd be fine if communism didn't kill thousands of innocent people, if you know what I mean.
No, I don't know what you mean. I'm sorry. So I'm going to ask if any of the speakers would like to say any final words before we close, because normally we try to keep these to 2 hours, and we're 8 minutes short of 2 hours. So just want to know if anybody would like to say any final words from amongst our speakers? Well, in which case, I think this has been an absolutely wonderful webinar. Thanks to fantastic speakers and great participation. And I think, you know, my kind of delight at this webinar, I think, is reflected from the overwhelming majority of the chat. I'd just like to thank everybody who worked so hard to put this together. The people in Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group often working behind the scenes to make a success of these things. Thanks to our wonderful speakers, all very distinguished comrades in their own right, who took time out of their busy schedule to share their knowledge and inspiration with us, and all of you who took time out at whatever time of the day it is in your part of the world to join us. Thank you all very much. Sign up to mailings from the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China if you haven't already done so. Keep an eye out for our activities. Be in touch, and let us know your ideas and thoughts, and look forward to working together with all of you. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heath.
Thanks.